إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد بعدد كل داء ودواء وبارك وسلم عليه وعليهم كثيرا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Today we're going to have a look at the early years. So we did start the early years. We looked at the early childhood of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in the last lesson and the journey he took, the famous journey to Syria. And now we're back in Mecca having a look at his earliest formative years after that period up till the time he's about 20. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So as a young boy, he grew up the same as everybody else. You know, they play, they have fun, they do what all kids do, except that Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was known for being a very thoughtful child and more refined and more cultivated than all the other kids. And he wouldn't get involved in everything that they would get involved with because he was created for a higher purpose. So you know when like kids just play 24 hours a day and there's no time for contemplation, Rasulullah would even then have a gravitas about him and a slight difference that you could see. He stood out from the others but without standing out, if you know what that means. So normal standing out is someone who acts a bit strange and he stands out. Then there's that person, he stands out because he acts noble, right? But you have to look at him to know. So when all kids are playing together, all kids look the same, but if you observe them for a few minutes, you see that one is a bit different. There is an aura around him. Just like human beings, you have humans that have, like, you cannot always cultivate charisma. Charismatic leaders are born. They have something naturally inherent in their personality, and cultivating it can get you so far. But many people have it naturally. So Rasulullah had these naturally, and if you observed him, you would see something different about this child. But amongst all the other children, he would have probably been just like every other child, playing and enjoying himself, except for that he was probably, you know, of exceptional beauty. Like, not probably, he was of exceptional beauty. Some things that stood him out as he was growing up is that he never ate sacrificed meat upon idols. Spelling mistake here. So they would have idols, they would sacrifice in the name of the idol and the meat would be distributed. Rasulullah would never eat. He had an aversion to that kind of meat and Allah saved him from eating any meat like that. As he grew older, many of the young youths at a certain age would start drinking. He never drank alcohol, as did his best friend Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, who never ever drank alcohol in his life also. He never gambled. Kids have a natural tendency to start gambling. If you leave kids to themselves, they'd play games for something, and then it can turn into gambling for favors, gambling for money, gambling for anything. He never involved himself in any of those kind of games. And he had a dislike for idols. He never went near any idols. And he had a dislike for poetry, right? So he didn't like poetry. This is one thing that set him apart from everybody else, because the Arabs in their culture, they love poetry. So for Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to not like poetry, this would automatically set you apart. One reason why he didn't like poetry is, as I mentioned in previous lessons, is pre-Islamic Arab poetry at that time had nothing really of value to it. Had it been something of very deep, pondering philosophical messages, who knows, maybe Rasulullah would have appreciated it. But at that time, the poetry wasn't something that you think, okay, I want to remember these verses. For what? A waste of time. And poetry gatherings generally tend to, if you let them go to their natural conclusion, you're going to get all sorts of untoward activity happening. First it's poetry, and then it's dancing girls, and then it's drink, and all the rest of it, music and everything. This is for the elites and the aristocrats. You'd have simple poetry competitions as well, where people would sit and have poetry competitions. Another reason was he didn't like poetry, is understandable, is that had he liked poetry or been a poet, when he revealed the Quran, they could have accused him and said, well, you were always a poet, you've just ended up reformulating this poetry into something that's different, and it's the Quran. But nobody could lay that claim on him. Nobody could say that he was a good poet or he knew poetry, and now he's come with this amazing book, and of course he's the author because it's got his hallmark on it, and we knew him like this from before. Nobody can say that about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So Allah protected him there regarding poetry also. Now at a certain age 10, 11, 12, in a traditional society, everybody has to work. Kids don't hang around, right? There's no idle rich. Even the idle rich, they have some sort of employment for children, which would lead them into areas of experience that men have, right? So traditionally for the aristocratic people, that was herding, whether it was camel herding or whether it was a herding of sheep, right? And this hadith by Rasulullah, Allah has not sent any prophet, but he was a shepherd of sheep. The companions asked, even you, O Messenger of Allah? He said, yes, I used to herd them for the people of Mecca for some qirat. Qirat, this is a very small payment. So Rasulullah made himself useful. He knew that Abu Talib's situation wasn't that good. And instead of him saying, well, I'm a young kid, I'm just going to expect to be fed. No, he was proactive. This is what we learn from here. Children should be proactive as well, and take parts of responsibility that you're able to do. So it wasn't just Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, it was all aristocratic kids. They went out into the desert and they herded or shepherded sheep or camels. You can imagine a camel herder, a camel shepherd would feel a bit more privileged because camels are aristocratic, noble, and they're camels. They're harder to look after. That's depending on what we talk about hard as compared to sheep, which are also, you need to really look out for them as well. But camels don't have many natural enemies in the desert. Sometimes they can get haughty. Sometimes they're difficult to control. But if you've got a good relationship with them, it's easy to look after them. They generally tend to look after themselves anyway. They don't eat much. They don't drink much. And they find their own herbage even in the desert, sparse herbage of the desert. They'll find it. They'll even eat thorns. So you can imagine the young kid who's herding camels, and he meets the kid who's herding goats, and he says, well, I'm herding camels, so I'm better than you, this kind of an exchange, right? But Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam herded goats. Now, it's very humble. Imagine telling people, I'm a goat herder. That's a very humbling thing to say, right? And why did he do it? It was a way of showing gratitude. Oh, my uncle, you have done so much for me. Your situation isn't very good, and I want to do something back, right? So, even within himself, he could have said this to Rasulullah, or he could have said it to his uncle, and he went and helped out with the herds. Also, helping out in financial means, Abu Talib, he never went back on another expedition that we know of. another trade trip to Syria that we know of. So this seems like it was the only one. And after that, they just settled down, and his financial situation wasn't that good, and it seems like Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam wanted to help out also, and also to stand up and be chivalrous, to take ownership. You'd normally expect adults to take ownership, not children, but Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam as a child had enough awareness and sense to stand up and take ownership as a boy and say, listen, I can do this and I want to do this for many reasons and I'm going to do this. Work is work. It's better than staying idle despite the wages. He didn't earn much, like it was less than the minimum wage, you can say. When he said kurut or kirat or however you pronounce that word, it was less than the minimum wage. But the idea is that it's work. So why, before I move on to the next slide, why do you think that every prophet had to do shepherding? Why shepherding? Why was it a rite of passage, so to speak, for every prophet to do shepherding?
Thank you. By practicing the act of shepherding, you've become patient. You become you generate certain skills that you otherwise wouldn't, like patience and gratitude and just looking after your responsibilities.
Yep. You're on the right. You basically said it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Just certain keywords missing, which we look at, but your answer's perfect. So, training in patience, as you said, shepherding requires long hours of watchfulness, enduring heat, cold, and hardship. Shepherds, it's a very difficult job. You're in the middle of nowhere, limited water. It's hot, so what? You sit there. It's cold, so what? Bear it. And watch your sheep. It makes you very patient in life. Also, gentleness and care. Sheep are weak and vulnerable, and tending to them, you develop compassion and kindness. A shepherd knows all of his sheep. He can see the strong ones, the weak ones, the feisty ones, the mischievous ones, the slightly depressed ones, the sad ones. If something changes in a sheep, he will know something has gone wrong, and depending on how much he knows that sheep, he will know what's wrong with it. So you can substitute sheep for human beings, right? So this is all training for a prophet now. Sheep are quite silly animals, right? You have to see them to know this. The way they will just, if you ever see them try to leave a barn, they will all leave together and get stuck. If you ever see the way the dogs handle them, right? The farmer blows the whistle and the dog runs this way and they all run that way. They run and he can channel them wherever he wants. Right, so and they get into all sorts of trouble. They fall into ditches. They get stuck into odd places. So the farmer needs to have a constant watchful eye, the shepherd, on his flock. And leadership preparation. A shepherd learns to guide, protect, and he learns to guide and to protect, and he learns discipline for himself. Skills later needed to lead people. Every human being is like a sheep. They have different personalities, and you have to speak to them on their terms. So if you get a stubborn sheep, you can't start beating it. You have to give it some food, deal with it in a specific way to get it to move. If you get a soft sheep, you can just stroke it, call it sweetly, it will come. So likewise, human beings are different and you have to treat them in different ways. A shepherd is accountable for every sheep, just as prophets are accountable for guiding their nations. Solitude and reflection, spending time in open nature fosters contemplation, sincerity and closeness to Allah. This is one of the special things about shepherds, is that when you're away from townspeople, when you're away and there is nature and all you can see is the firmament, the stars above and the empty barren land or the green land below you and the odd sheep that you're looking at, your senses quieten down and your higher senses open, and instead of asking the mundane questions, you start to ask the deeper questions about life, the hows and the whys. You start to question within yourself, and you develop a sense of spirituality. You don't need to believe in a God to develop a sense of spirituality, right? To cultivate the spirit, to make it highly attuned to reality. The human mind and spirit ultimately by itself comes to the realization of a creator. So this is what it does for everybody. Anybody who spent time alone, they become wise. Humility, it teaches simplicity and lowliness, preventing arrogance before being entrusted with prophethood. Like I told you, the difference between a camel herder and a goat herder. Protection from corruption, such work kept them away from worldly distractions and sinful environments. So a young kid, formative years, they learn swearing, they start to learn sin, they start to learn bad things, they get crafty. You know how all kids are who play on the streets. This happens in every street, right? You're going to meet that one kid that's going to give something bad to you, teach you something bad, or you're going to hang around with a group of kids that are not the best. Stealing, swearing, cheating, lying, backbiting, fighting, planning, bullying, planning, scheming. All kids go through this phase. So once you've got that kid out in the desert, he's not going to learn any of those sins. So it's a natural protection for the child. Now I'll read one and then you can read one. So these are quotes from some scholars of the past, the Imams of the past, on shepherding. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, in his commentary on the Hadith in Fath al-Bari, he writes, shepherding develops patience. Since sheep scatter easily and must constantly be gathered, it trains one in gentleness and compassion. Because sheep are weak and easily frightened, it teaches leadership skills. For if a person can manage sheep, he can later manage people with different temperaments. Do you want to read Imam al-Qurtubi?
In his tafsir, Imam al-Qurtubi and other works, he notes, Allah chose shepherding because it is humble work, far removed from pride and arrogance. It provides a period of solitude, away from worldly corruption, preparing the heart for revelation.
Excellent. Ibn Khaldun said in his Muqaddimah, he reflects more generally on pastoral life. Those who live amongst animals and nature develop simplicity, strength and reliance on God. Prophets were made to pass through this stage to build resilience, discipline before being given authority over nations.
Imam al-Munawi in Faid al-Qadir, he explains, the shepherd is constantly watchful and protective, standing between his flock and danger. The mirrors the prophet's role as a guardian who protects his community from misguidance and
harm. So thank you very much for this. So imagine a prophet and you ask him and you say, so you're a prophet of God, what did you do? My grandfather was a billionaire, my father was a multimillionaire, and I've lived my whole life in luxury. Right? It's very different than when you say, I was a simple shepherd. I understand the from the ground up, I understand society, I understand animals, I understand nature, I understand human beings. I understand the higher beings, the angels. I have an understanding that Allah has given me about Himself. So this is why the prophets,
it becomes inherent in you, in your childhood.
Yes, whatever you do as a child, those skills you take on into adulthood. So if you're trained in gentleness, if you're trained to observe people, if you're trained to treat people differently, right? We tend to treat people the same way. If we're aggressive to everybody. If we're overly kind, we're overly kind to everybody. But here, it's treating, from a young age, you decide, you treat them equal in the sense that you show love and care and protection to all of them, just like you did to the sheep. But then you see individual differences and then you treat them differently accordingly. Concern. So the big takeaway from here is the concern, right? There's an ayah in the Quran also, perhaps you, O Muhammad, would kill yourself in grief if they do not submit to embracing Islam. Rasulullah, when he would give da'wah and they wouldn't accept, he would be so concerned for them, he would be so worried for them, so sad for them, and his grief would overwhelm him. So Allah said, perhaps you will kill yourself in grief. Your grief overwhelms you that they don't submit to Islam. So Allah is calming the Prophet down, right? That it's all in Allah's hands at the end of the day. And in Surah Al-Ahzab, the Prophet is closer to the believers than they are to their own selves. So it's like a shepherd is closer to the sheep than the sheep is to itself, right? The sheep cannot survive without the shepherd. The shepherd is the one that guides it, looks after it, waters it, sends it to the correct pastures, and gives it, protects it from the wolves. Right? City people generally are like that. We can no longer fend for ourselves. So the biggest takeaway that a shepherd has above everything else is concern. Because why is he there? He's there to make sure that those sheep survive. So Rasulullah is there to make sure that we survive into the hereafter. We get into Jannah. So it's concern for mankind, and that concern overwhelmed him. So Allah was fully capable of providing Rasulullah with all the comforts of life and free him from the trouble of earning his livelihood. But Allah wished to impress on us that the best of livelihood is that which a man earns from himself through his own efforts, and that a man's value is in how much he can contribute through his meager means towards the welfare of society. So in society, like the idle rich, they don't do anything. Right? If they do anything, it's for themselves now. Right? Poor people tend to give more charity than rich people do. And they do it out of the goodness of their heart, whereas a rich person, yes, there are those that do it out of the goodness of their heart, but sometimes there's vested interests that a poor person doesn't have. And if Allah's given you the time, right, you're part of a cohesive society that is there so that you can survive. If you are taken out of that society, you would not be able to survive on your own. Even today, if we're taken out of society, if we were taken out of the city, and if we were taken out of the city and we were told to fend for ourselves, not one of us could survive alone. We couldn't hunt an animal, we couldn't skin an animal, we couldn't make a shelter, we couldn't make fire, we couldn't purify water, we wouldn't know which plants are healing or poisonous, we wouldn't know anything, right? So a system has been made up, and that system wasn't made by one man, it was the collective effort of society. So the parasites are people that live off society and don't contribute, and they cause harm. So we're talking about certain, I'm going to use a crude English term, chabbies, that don't educate themselves, don't work, are idle, they get some money from the government, and because of their idleness, they fill their time up by committing crime. So those people are parasites, no good to society. In fact, they cause harm to society. People like that need to be curtailed, they're sent to prison, they're punished. In some societies, you'd be lashed. Worst case scenario, your head would be chopped off depending on your crime. It purifies society from parasites. But if you all contribute like the colony of the ant's nest or the bee's nest, every member has a duty, no matter how small. So likewise, contribute through your meager means, no matter what it is, to your family and at large society. Those that are engaged in propagation and depend on people's donations do not enjoy much respect. It is better for a person to depend on his own meager means of livelihood and avoid dependencies on others, so that no one should taunt him over material help, and so that he should be able to present his message with full moral force. So this is what we just covered. There's many of the rock carvings in the desert that we had a look at before. many were done by travelers, and there's also carvings done by shepherds. You know, they've got nothing to do in the desert, so they start carving on rock. And the one mystery again that we are contending with is that in a society where everybody was supposed to be illiterate, how could these people end up writing on rock faces? This is something that's still very strange to us. So the young teenagers would sit, talk, make friendships, and even plan as teenagers do. So, you know, you form lifelong friendships, you discuss deeper subjects, right? But as all teenagers, you also want to try bigger and more glitzy things that you see the adults do, right? So there's a famous story in the Seerah that I had a problem with the minute I read the story. It's in many of the books, and we'll have a look at the story now. So would you like to read, Shahid?
Story of the party. I never thought about taking part in what the people who lived in ignorance were organizing in the way of entertainment, except on 2 nights. On both occasions, God protected me against evil. One night I said to one of my fellow shepherds, "Would you kindly look after my sheep to give me a chance to go down to Makkah and attend a social function like other boys do?" He was willing to do that. I went to Makkah. As I entered, I heard music and singing in the first house. I asked what the occasion was, and I was told that it was a wedding party. I sat down to look. Soon my head was heavy and I slept. I was awoken only the next morning by the heat of the sun. I went back to my friend and reported to him what had happened. I did it again, and the same thing happened to me. I never again thought or did anything of this sort until God honored me with prophethood.
Excellent, well done. Have you heard this story before? It's not in Martin Ling's, but it's in the other seerahs, right? Martin Ling's seerah is by far the most beautiful seerah, but many a story is not in there because it's either controversial or it doesn't flow with the general beauty of the book. And everybody does this in seerah, right? So you'll not get any complete seerah. There's always going to be stories that they've left out for various reasons. So this one, if you read any other seerah, you'll come across this, the seerahs that are more detailed, right? Not necessarily more beautiful, just with more information of this kind. So knowing what I know about the personality of my messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this story didn't sit well with me. I checked the references and everything. It's in the Arabic seerahs, CR, by the way, and I saw it in Arabic. I checked the reference and everything, but it just didn't sit well with me, right? Then lo and behold, in my research, I found out that Ibn Kathir holds this to be a strange report. Further, he said that it seems like the narrator mixed up his own experience in this particular hadith. So some have accepted it, some haven't accepted it. If you accept it, this is just the inclinations of a young teenage boy of 15, should we say, who wants, you know, he can hear the music, he can hear the laughter, and he's thinking, what is that? Let's have a look. Let's see what all the fuss is about. And he goes, and Allah saves him from this. So he never gets to experience it. Allah saves him from this. If you believe that, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, as every teenage boy, he had the desire to see what's going on there, what's the fuss about, and Allah saved him. But personally, I have a problem with this story. I don't think the story is sound. I don't believe this story. I follow the vein of Ibn Kathir here, that this story seems problematic. Also, Bayhaqi reported through Zayd ibn Haritha that Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam never touched a deity. Zayd ibn Haritha was his adopted son, right? So this story is a first-hand account. This is a first-hand account from his own adopted son. You find many versions. So with each story in the Seerah, you'll sometimes find slight different versions of them. So the same story you hear from different shuyukh, they'll give you different versions. They may even give you different places, right? Like there's one story that I'm going to narrate after this, and I'm going to say he stood outside the Kaaba. Somebody else will say he stood outside, and I heard a sheikh say he stood by Safa Marwa. And another sheikh I heard say he stood by Abu Qubays mountain. The thing is that these are tiny details, tiny variations, but we look at the main message. So there's variations of this story as well. I didn't quote all of them. I just cut it short, right? The gist of it is that the reason I didn't quote the various versions is because they didn't sit well with me. You know, I don't think Rasulullah would have done exactly what was written in the hadith. So then I quoted another one. Now, like I said, in the Seerah, there are many reports, right? There's a lot of akhbar. People put in weak narrations. There's a lot of weak narrations, different versions of narrations. Even some of the authentic narrations, a part of it may be correct, then the second part might be problematic. Like we looked at the hadith of Bahira the monk, right? The hadith is sound. Imam Tirmidhi said the hadith is sound, but he said the last part, he said that it seems like the narrator mixed up two different hadith, i.e. Abu Bakr and Bilal took Rasulullah back to Mecca. That wasn't possible, right? Because Bilal wasn't born and Abu Bakr was 2 years younger. So if Rasulullah was 8, Abu Bakr was 6. So likewise, I'm just going to give you the gist of this one. Bayhaqi reported through Zayd ibn Haritha that Rasulullah never touched a deity. In pre-Islamic times, he used to prevent others from doing it. Similarly, at the time of circumambulation of the Kaaba, he would not touch the deities Isaf and Na'ila. So Zayd ibn Haritha, there's a story that, you know, he was told Rasulullah would tell Zayd ibn Haritha, don't touch the deities, don't touch the deities. Zayd ibn Haritha would touch them and the Rasulullah would be displeased with him, saying, why are you touching the deities? Something like that. Another version is that he went to touch the deity. No, he didn't. He wouldn't want to touch the deity, but when he went close to it, Rasulullah came back and said, I saw a man, you know, who warned me away from it. Or, you know, like a strange experience. So after that, I didn't go to the deities. There are many stories, but for me, the strongest one is Rasulullah had a natural aversion from going near any deity, right? If you don't believe that they're gods, and if they're a fake god, it's like you're thinking, how dare you try to take the position of my God in your fakeness. So you don't go near them. There's no reason to go near them. Ibn Ishaq has reported that when the monk Bahira swore by Allat and Uzza, we looked at this last week, he said, I urge you in the name of Allat and Uzza, tell me about yourself. Rasulullah is purported to have said, do not use those names in front of me, for by Allah there is nothing that I hate more than these two. Right? Don't ask me anything in the name of Allah and Uzza. I've never hated anything more than I hate them. So then he said, the monk deliberately did that. The monk was a Christian, a believer in Al-Ilah, Allah. But he deliberately did that to test him, to see what the response would be, because the monk believed that this was a future prophet. So when Rasulullah answered correctly, that, you know, confirmed him in his opinion that this is a future prophet. That's why he tested him by doing that. The Prophet also refused to spend time near the Buwaina deity, at which place the Quraysh used to conduct celebrations once every year. Abu Talib and his other uncles were very angry with him over that. And apparently his aunties as well. When the Prophet was about to give in to their pressure, see, this is the problematic part. That's why I wrote strange tradition at the bottom. When the Prophet was about to give in to their pressure, Allah saved him by sending him a tall, fair man who commanded him not to touch the deities. After that, the Prophet never participated in any of their celebrations. So you can see myself, I've mixed the traditions also. Because I didn't care too much for the traditions, even as I narrated it, I'd mixed two traditions up, right? The one about where a tall, fair man who commanded him not to touch, this is from this particular story, right? And this is this story has its parallel with the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. When Ibrahim alayhi salam says, why are you not going to go to this celebration with us? He says, I'm sick, because his intention was to smash the idols. Rasulullah, there was this festival, like a yearly festival at a shrine of a deity. So Abu Talib and the uncles and the aunties and all of them went, and they wanted to take him, and he refused to go. And then, they kept pleading with him, come on, what are you doing? Let's go. And he's like, I don't want to go. And then they got angry with him, right? The difference is that Ibrahim said, I'm sick, so I can't go. And the Rasul outright said, I don't want to go, right? Was a reason given? We don't know, but he just said, I don't want to go. And that's understandable, but then it gets strange. Okay, he finally gave in, and then he saw a tall man that saved him. I don't believe Rasul would give in like that. So his modesty, his dignity, his honor before revelation, it was well known. Everybody knew. Ibn Abbas, who is his nephew, is his cousin. Ibn Abbas is his cousin. Ibn Abbas was the son of Abbas, who is Rasul's contemporary. His uncle, probably about 3 years older than him. It was a trio: Abbas, Hamza, and Rasul around the same age. Abbas. Normally, I like to introduce figures as they come for the first time, but I'm not going to introduce Abbas now because we've got a lot to talk about him later on. So I was with my nephew carrying the rock. So this is a story now. Now we're looking at his modesty, dignity, honor before revelation. Now again, this story has a few versions of it in the books. Right? Martin Lings hasn't written it. It's in many of the other books, and there are different versions of this story. So we're going to read it now. Actually, Shahid, you can read the story.
I was with my nephew carrying the rocks, wearing our shirts around our necks. When we came up to the other people, we covered up. While I was walking along with Muhammad in front of me, he fell down and stretched out flat on his face. I hurried along, threw down my rocks. Meanwhile, he was looking up to heaven. What's wrong? I asked. He got up and took his shirt, saying, I was forbidden from walking uncovered. Ibn Abbas went on, I hid this from the others for fear they would say he was mad.
So this is narrated by Ibn Abbas, who's narrating from his father, right? So Ibn Abbas went on, yeah. So this is his father telling the story, Abbas telling the story. I was with my nephew carrying the rocks, wearing our shirts. So already, can you see the problem with this? No, they're about the same age, right? So I was with my nephew carrying rocks, wearing our shirts around our necks. When we came to other people, we would cover up. So basically, they're walking around naked, right? Do you remember I told you I showed you pictures of traditional Arab clothing. The poor people would only have a futa, izhar, sarong, whatever you want to call it, and they would be bare-chested. If you had an extra garment, you'd wear a shirt. And if you're carrying rocks, right, this was, I think this was the building of the Kaaba or something, I'm not sure what this was, but if you're carrying rocks on your shoulder, on your bare shoulders, or a thin cloth, it's going to hurt. So what they would do is they would take their futa, their skirt off, because that was the largest piece of garment that they would have, and they would use it as some kind of a soft thing on their shoulder where they would place the stone so it wouldn't dig into the flesh, right? Which basically means you're walking around naked. Now, if you're thinking this is very strange, you can see Thizija. I told everybody to read the book in the lecture called Man and Camel, or Badu and Camel. In that lecture, that was basically a lot of the narration for that particular video came from that book, right? And the idea was to introduce Bedouin society through the eyes of a Westerner who probably saw the last living tradition of true Bedouin society before it died due to modernity. And he spent time in Iraq in the marshes with the Marsh Arabs. The Marsh Arabs are traditionally not Arabs. We covered this as well, that they have a lot of markers in them that we think that they're the Sumerians, the black-headed ones who were not Arabs. And I showed you how their reed huts, the way they make their reed huts, are exactly the same as you see the Sumerians make them 6,000 years ago. Subhanallah, right? It's the same living. Saddam Hussein destroyed the marshes. You can Google marsh Arabs, right? Iraqi marsh Arabs to learn more about them. They look down upon by normal Arabs. And if you read the book that he wrote when he was there for 10 years, just before the revolution in Iraq in the 1950s, in that book is a picture of Arabs that are naked, completely naked. There's a guy completely naked. You can see everything on a boat. And this is supposed to be Muslim, right? So it's not unfathomable that people did strange things, right? So first of all, my prophet would never ever, he was a modest person. He was a modest prophet. He was incredibly shy, right? The companions would say that he was more shy than a virgin bride, right? And these kind of people, don't just throw their clothes off. Shy people don't even like revealing their chest. Shy people, they don't reveal their emotions or their physicality or anything. And the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was walking around naked. That's the first problem. Second problem is that he said, in one narration, he said, I was hit. Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam himself is saying, I was hit, right? And, I took a blow from an angel who said, oh, Muhammad, you are not made for these kind of things, right? And an angel, would an angel dare lay his hands on the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? Impossible. And the third thing is that the other account of the story, his uncle, he's saying to him, oh nephew, why don't you put your cloth over your head, over your shoulder, X, Y, and Z, right? Now, you have to look at the dynamics here, right? So your uncle is telling you something and you will obey, right? Generally, people obey their uncles. But what if your uncle is the same age as you? If your uncle is around the same age as you, now it's, even though he's your uncle, if you've got greater charisma, if you've got greater honor, dignity, and charisma, even if you're the nephew, you tend to have the upper hand, right? So I don't think Abbas would have been in a position to tell his nephew, oh, Muhammad, do this, especially when it came to something like this. Or for Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to say, okay, uncle, okay. It just wouldn't work. The dynamic is, the age is too close, right? And clearly Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is the nephew that has more charisma, more honor, more dignity, more haiba, more awe. So then the uncle needs to also be careful how the uncle addresses the nephew as well, right? And you can see this happening in real life everywhere. And also, the point just left me. But basically, yeah, that's the gist of it. So we're raising these stories, like I said to you, we're just covering stuff from the Seerah. Even if it's not in the book, it's in other books, we're covering it. But again, we're scrutinizing everything. We're checking references. What's a lie, we're exposing. What's weak, we're exposing. What's untenable, we're exposing. We're not leaving any stone uncovered. So this is why we're going through it. So again, this is another story, right? Narrated by Zayd ibn Haritha. There was a brass idol called Isafa Na'ila, right? When you copy and paste, sometimes the spelling is off, which the polytheists would touch as they performed their circumambulation. The Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, don't touch it. Zayd continued, well, as we went around again, I told myself I would touch it to see what would happen. When I did so, the Prophet ﷺ asked me, were you not forbidden to do that? Al-Bahaki said that others added from Muhammad bin Amr, given a chain of authorities, that Zayd said, by him who honored him and revealed to him my holy book, the Prophet, never saluted an idol right up to when God Almighty honored him as he did and gave him revelation to him. So this is just the same story that I told you before. So what do kids do? What do all kids do? And especially the aristocratic kids, because the aristocratic kids have access to more wealth, more weapons, and a bit more time, we could say. Not necessarily always more time, but they have certain privileges, such as having weapons that most people don't have. A poor person would not have a sword. A poor person would only have a spear. Okay, it's very easy to make a spear. You just sharpen a stick. If you've got a bit of money, you buy a spearhead and you join it together and you're done. Whereas to own a sword was expensive, and to own a bow and arrow was expensive. So Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was trained, as all aristocratic boys were, in martial arts. So when we say martial arts, we're not talking about martial arts that we know today as world famous martial arts that are Chinese or Japanese or Korean. Every nation had its own version of a martial art. There's nothing spectacular about the Asian martial arts over any other martial art, except for that they've been cultivated more, made into an art form, which is what they are. A lot of the moves you see are moves to beautify it. They're not practical. They're never used in real life. And you can get MMA bouts where they get they get humiliated. All of these Chinese and all of these flowery martial arts that you see, these guys get completely humiliated in the octagon by MMA fighters who beat the living daylights out of them, because they're just show and flowery. But real training is the same all over the world. You know, you're going to learn how to wrestle. Wrestling all over the world is the same. You're going to learn how to subdue an enemy. You're going to learn how to punch. You're going to learn how to, take blows and how to counter and things like that. So Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was trained in the bow. He was trained in the sword. He owned swords. He owned bows, spears. If you read the other sciences attached to the Seerah as add-ons, ancillary sciences, you come across even the names of these things. He was good at wrestling. He was good at horse riding. He was trained, his training partners were his uncles, Abbas and Hamza, because they were, all of them were about the same age. So there's a story here about the prowess of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Do you want to read it, Shahid?
Hashim ibn Abdul Muttalib ibn Abdul Manaf bin Qusay al-Qurayshi al-Mutalabi. He was also well learned in the art of wrestling, and his name and fame was spread to all corners of Arabia. Many people from all corners came to challenge him, but none of them managed to beat him. One day, he was walking in a certain valley when he met the Holy Prophet, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him, who asked him, O Rukana, do you not fear Allah Almighty, and do you not accept my message? Rukana replied, if you can't beat me in wrestling, then I will accept your message. The Holy Prophet, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him, replied, if that is the case, then you should prepare to wrestle. Then they began to fight, and the Holy Prophet, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him, threw him to the floor. The second time also, the same thing happened. The third time also, the same thing happened. Obviously, Rukana was extremely surprised, and he began to think how like this something could happen. He also knew that he had beaten numerous opponents in the past, and no one was able to throw him to the floor that easy before. He then mentioned the Holy Prophet, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him. Your affairs are very strange indeed. In other words, you are extremely strong. Rukana then accepted Islam, keeping to his promise.
Okay, so this is a beautiful story, but it's not dramatic. It's very poetically and well written. To make it dramatic, so it sinks in exactly what happened, let's use today's language. You know, like when you wrestle, let's say you arm wrestle someone, and you look at them and you're like, I'm a champ. Look at your puny arms. Look at your small hand. Look at your, I don't see you as someone who's going to beat me, right? And then you hold their hand, and the minute the arm wrestle starts, they beat you so fast. You're like, whoa, hold on a minute. No, okay. All right, okay, I see what's going on here. You're not going to get me this time. Let's start again. I overestimated you. I underestimated you, right? So, and then you do it again and you're beaten, right? And then it starts to dawn on you what's going on here, right? So when Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam just grabbed him and threw him, he was in shock. He was like, what? Do that again. Do that again. Right? So he actually said to Rasulullah, do that again. Okay, that was an oversight. I obviously underestimated you. You've got some skill. This shouldn't have happened. Come on, let's go again. And then they wrestled again, and he was thrown again. And then he was thrown a third time. And then he's thinking, like, what just happened here? Right? Your affairs are very strange indeed. Right? How could this even have happened? And then he kept his promise. Right? He was an honorable person, and he accepted Islam. So Rasulullah, he said, I have the strength of 40 of you. Right? And that was physical, and that was sexual as well. He married more women. And often sexual and physical health goes hand in hand, and it's no shame in saying that as well. And then there's another hadith about the use of a sword, and this is another beautiful hadith, by the way. Rasulullah was once resting under the shade of a tree. So this is a part of the hadith that I'm going to read to you. Okay, the whole hadith has slightly different wording, but I'm just going to read it in my way. So Rasulullah was once resting under the shade of a tree, having hung his sword upon one of its branches. A man from amongst the enemies, his name is reported as Ghawrath ibn al-Harith in some narrations, came quietly, took the sword and said, Aha, who will protect you from me now, O Muhammad? So you can imagine Rasulullah is resting, and all of a sudden there's a man above you with your own sword, right? And Rasulullah gets up and he says, Allah will protect me against you. At that moment, the man got shook up. Something happened to him and he dropped the sword. He was shocked because he was supposed to be a bit of a champion. You're within striking distance. You've got the sword. What do you think the natural actions of the other person is going to be? The other person is either going to run or like pause in fear, or try not to make a sudden movement because you might strike, or try to do something else, right? Or plead with you. And the Rasulullah was just calm, right? And you can almost say a smile came from his lips. This is my exaggeration here. And he said, Allah, who do you think is going to protect me? Allah is going to protect me. Come, we go. At that moment, the man trembled and the sword dropped from his hand. And this is the beautiful part. Rasulullah then picked up the sword and said to him, so now, my fine friend, who is going to protect you from me now? Subhanallah. So see how it just turned around, right? He had the sword, he dropped it, and he said, who's going to protect you? Allah. He drops the sword and the Prophet picks it up and says, now who's going to protect you from me? Right? But Rasulullah didn't harm him and he forgave him. I don't know if the man became a Muslim or not. It doesn't mention that in the hadith. The hadith, Prophet ﷺ is telling the companions, he says, look at him here, sitting here now. This is the narration is here. You can check it out. It's actually different from the way I've said it, right? But the gist of it is the same, by the way. Right, and archery, also regarding archery, despite having all of these weapons, Rasulullah was skilled. He was the most skilled in archery, right? So archery doesn't seem like the most glamorous or the most sport that you would think, that, yeah, man, I'm an archer. Wow. People like to show off with swords, close hand-to-hand combat, flashy moves, the same thing with spears, the same thing with shields. But what can you do? What flashy moves can you do with a bow and arrow? You just stand there and shoot at an enemy in the distance. But the bow and arrow is the most, the best weapon, especially in a war, because you can get to the enemy before they've even got close enough to use their swords. So he was the most skilled in archery. He had keen eyesight, which aids in this, and a calm, collected mind. If you've ever done archery, you need a very calm body, movements, and a mind. And you need keen eyesight. And Rasulullah had keen eyesight. I mentioned to you in the beginning that the Pleiades, the 7 sisters, most people see, they call it 7 sisters because most people would probably see on average 7 stars, some 6, some 8. Rasulullah was reported to have seen, I think, 12 of those stars. So you can look, if you want to measure your eyesight, if you want to measure your eyesight against Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right, and count the stars, if you can count 12, praise Allah that He's given you the same eyesight as Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. You've got one thing similar with him now, right? It's a beautiful exercise. So, but you need to go into like the desert to count the stars. By the way, in the city, you will see a mass. That's it, or not even see it. Uqba bin Amr al-Juhani, may Allah be pleased with him, reported, I heard the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam saying from the pulpit, prepare to meet them, the enemy, with as much strength as you can afford. Verily, strength is in archery, strength is in archery, strength is in archery. Sahih Hadith. Right. So if you look today, why is Israel dominant over all the countries that it fights? Because it's got long distance weapons. The metaphorical bow and arrow. It has it, other people don't have it. Why was Iran the only one of those countries able to do some damage? Because Iran has the metaphorical bow and arrow also. So then we go into two important events that happened, and one of them definitely shaped the thinking of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So we have something called the Harb al-Fijar, right? This was a war to do with tribal honor. This was in 580. Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was probably 14, 15 or age 20. The accounts differ, but if we look at the whole time frame of the war, about 6 years or 4 years, then you can understand each of the reports is correct then. So, for example, why was it called Fijar? The war is called Fijar from Fujur, from sacrilege, transgression. Because why? Because fighting broke out during the sacred months. So we have the 4 sacred months, right? We mentioned them. And Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram and Rajab. So 3 of them together. Muharram is on its own. Rajab is one of them is on its own. And 3 of them come one after the other. Muharram is, the name says it itself. It's it's sanctified, and it's the first month of the new calendar. So when warfare is prohibited, so just like in the Haram area, the sacred sanctified area around Mecca, there's no fighting allowed in there, and there's 4 months where the Arabs wouldn't fight. So they would intercalate the calendars and change those dates around, so they would allow fighting for themselves, which is totally forbidden. But they all knew these months, and they were supposed to respect these months. So it became known as the sacrilegious war, that you've just, you've done something very bad. You started fighting in a sacred month. To violate the sanctity was considered fujur, hence halbar fujur, al-fijar. So what happened? So King Nu'man of Hira, remember, Nu'man was one of the kings of the Lukhmids in Iran, Iraq. Arab king. Hira was the capital. We mentioned this before. He sent a caravan to Okaz. Okaz was, do you remember the 12 major markets in Arabia? We discussed and we said that 2 or 3 of them were under the sway of the Quraysh. Okaz market, which is outside Mecca, at a bit of a distance, was under the sway of the Qurayshis. They ran that market, and it was a central location. People from all over came, and it was a time for poetry. It was a time for Christians would come and do their evangelizing, proselytizing. I wouldn't really call it evangel because that's a different sect of Christianity. And other people would come, and you could do all sorts and get away with it. It was sanctified. When I say all sorts, I'm not saying bad things. I'm talking about stuff like this. And then there was a particular one of the guys who was responsible for taking the caravan. Now there are different stories, and some of the stories don't make sense. So I just copied the one that made sense to me, which was from Wikipedia. Right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be 100% accurate, although I believe it is. But I had to look at other accounts, and utterly confusing, right? So I'm just going to give you the account that made sense to me. So Al-Barad offered to escort a caravan through Kinana's territory. The Kinana were allied with the Quraysh. Urwa offered to guide it through Najd. So there were 2 people, and they said to the king, they said to the king Nu'man, your caravan that's going to the Uqaz market to trade this year, right? Al-Barad said, give it to me, I'll guarantee its safety and I'll escort it through the Kinana territory because they are my allies. Urwa said, no, I'll guide it through the Najd. King Nu'man chose Urwa and rejected Al-Barad. He said, okay, Urwa, you take them, right? And Al-Barad was rejected. So what he did then, right? So this is what we just spoke about now, right? So the markets of Uqaz, Mujannal, Dhul Ma'jaz, Ta'if were key seasonal fairs. They combined commerce, caravan trade, textiles, perfume, animals, poetry competitions, mu'allaqat, poets rose to fame, pilgrimage rituals, tribes assembled near the Kaaba. Quraysh of Mecca had special interest in keeping these sacred fairs peaceful since their economic dominance relied on the trade routes and sanctity of the pilgrimage. So what happened here is Al-Barad ibn Qais, who was an ally of Quraysh, he killed Urwa. So he got so jealous that he followed him and killed him. Right? Urwa al-Rahil al-Amri was a respected leader of the Banu Amr of the Qais Ailan tribe or tribal federation. So these are two different tribal federations now. Now you've got a problem. One guy affiliated somehow with the Quraysh has ended up killing a guy affiliated with the other group. Now we know what tribal warfare is like and we know what happens now. The problem is the murder happened during the sacred month and at a time of gathering for the Uqaz fair, making it a double problem for everybody involved. The slain man Urwa was under the protection of Al-Numair ibn Qais, chief of the Hawazin. This made it not only, that's a massive tribal confederation, this made it not only a personal blood feud but a clan and tribal honor crisis. So what was the inevitable result? Quraysh and Kinana rallied behind their man, and Qais Ailan, including the Hawazim, Thaqif and others, they rallied behind their man. So the lines for battle are drawn. Quraysh, so this is the same thing, right? But here's the interesting part about this war now. This war lasted about 6 years, 4 years, I think. But the actual days of fighting was about 6. That's it, right? So normally a fight, traditional warfare, as I even showed you footage of this and I even discussed it, it's not about completely slaying everybody. It's about getting revenge. It's about humiliating the enemy, getting revenge and leaving. Right? You don't want to unnecessarily cause bloodshed and kill. There was some humanity in ancient wars, especially of these kind of skirmish wars, right? Tribal people. It wasn't like the madness of war today where, kill civilians, collateral damage is acceptable, and preeminent strikes and cluster bombs, Hiroshima, and none of this, right? Or even before, we're talking last century where the British wouldn't take prisoners. No prisoners. You fight to the death. If we capture you, we're going to slay you anyway, so you may as well fight to the death. Right? It's crazy. Over there, they would fight in the morning and stop by midday and go home. And they would see each other next year. They would go home. Why? Because no one's going to fight in the middle of the day. You can barely sit in the heat when it's 45. How are you going to fight? Second thing is go home, because that's just the way it worked. So the actual days of fighting were skirmishes and only 1 day a year or something. So that's why when we go from the 4 years, if Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was between the ages of 14 and 20, we get different ideas of his age, and then all of them can be correct based on whoever wrote it for what year. So Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was too young to fight directly. And his uncles only used him to collect arrows. So when you fire arrows, that's your ammunition, right? You fired it to them, they've gained. If it's not hit anybody, they've gained. And what they've fired in yours, towards your lines, your side, it's sticking out of the ground. You've won those arrows. So you want somebody, normally kids, run and pick up the arrows, please, and bring them back. So this is what Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did. And this detail is significant. It shows he participated in defense but not in bloodshed. So even though it was a sacrilegious war, even though Quraysh sided with the wrong side, because they had no choice, because this is how warfare works. But now your side is being attacked, your family is being attacked, you have to defend. So Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam defended his side. So so this is like I said, this is the funniness about it, right? So in the immediate aftermath, right, Al-Barad, he was patronized by Harb ibn Umayyah. Harb ibn Umayyah is one of the famous progenitors of Abu Sufyan, of the Umayyad line. He is the father of Abu Sufyan, if I'm not mistaken, right? Abu Sufyan's father. Harb ibn Umayyah gathered other Quraysh tribal leaders to prepare for battle, knowing Hawazin would retaliate. The wealthy Taymite noble Abdullah ibn Jud'an supplied 100 fully armed Qurayshi fighters for the battle. The first major clash was at Nakhla, which was called Yom Nakhla. Hawazin launched their attack. Quraysh and Kinana retreated into the Haram area for protection, and they didn't follow. So that was the end of that, right? The Kilab tribe withdrew at this point, limiting their involvement. Then the next year, a battle was fought at Shamta near Ukaz. The same groups again, Quraysh and Kinana versus Hawazin. Crucially, Banu Amir and its sub-tribes, Ka'ab and Kilab, did not participate. Again, internal politics for whatever reason. The result, Hawazin were victorious in this year. The third year, they again fighted. Quraysh and Kinana faced each other. And the fourth year, the same in Aqaz, Yom Sharab, Quraysh and Kinana managed to defeat the Hawazin. They got back at them. Second clash again, Hawazin struck back and won. So basically, tit for tat, nobody's winning, nobody's losing. Everybody's just looking very bad here, because you're fighting during the sacred months and you've got no regard for the sacred month. And what's really happening here? What kind of a war is this anyway? Right? So after the war was concluded, after further minor skirmishes and peace terms were agreed, Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, we'll come to who he is. He's somebody we need to read about. He features in Badr, was killed there, and he initiated the peace terms between both sides, and they paid the blood money. The side that lost more had to take blood money from the side that lost less, and a peace was agreed. But everybody felt very strange about this. They felt very bad now after 4 years of this seemingly mindless nonsense. They started to feel that, what did we just do, and what kind of, how are we living? If we had because the Arabs were now trading with Rome, right? So they saw semblances of order. They saw what happens when you have one leader. They saw what happens when you have like a regular army that polices, when you have one leader. And none of this would have happened if there was just one leader and there was no tribalism in Mecca, right? So they're starting to think about this now. So Ibn Hisham said, the account of the sacrilegious war is very long, longer than I have recounted, but I have been deterred from recounting it because it would have interrupted the telling of the biography of the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So I looked it up, and he's mentioned it in less than what I mentioned it in. He just literally mentioned a few lines, right? And for good reason, because it's a silly war, and it goes off on a tangent, and it's got nothing to do with the biography of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Good on you. So the aftermath, the war lingered. The war left lingering shame amongst Quraysh, though they fought bravely. The act of violating sacred months tarnished their prestige. Many Meccans later reflected on the futility of the war, mere tribal vengeance spilling over into desecration of sanctity. This reflection likely laid the ground for moral pacts like Hilf al-Fudool, where Quraysh leaders swore to uphold justice and avoid oppression. So something happened straight afterwards. The result of it was very positive, and some say the result was only incredibly positive because of the disgrace that they had, the shame that they had felt during this 4 years of silliness. So as a result, the very next thing that happened, something positive came out of it. It's known as Hilf al-Fudool, the Pact of virtue, right? And to go beyond, the semantic feel of the word Fudool or Fadl means to go beyond something. Something good happened here, right? So now Rasulullah was about 20 years of age, so he's an adult now. And the backdrop is the post-Fijar atmosphere. After several years of tribal clashes, in Mecca was left in a morally fractured state, which means that they're just thinking, what the hell just happened here? Quraysh's reputation had been tainted. They had fought in the sacred months at the sacred fairs. So imagine every year you've got a fair. You're supposed to be protecting the fair. All of a sudden, every year, people are coming and they're seeing armed Quraysh and armed other gangs. And it's like gangland now, gangland warfare going on. Right? So, it didn't look nice for them. Mecca relied on its image as a place of security and trade and pilgrimage. So all three are damaged. A stain on its honor could hurt its commercial dominance. There was a growing sense amongst the more conscientious Quraysh leaders that a framework for justice was needed to prevent future dishonor. What was the catalyst now? What was the triggering incident? A merchant from Yemen bought valuable goods into Mecca, trusting the sanctity of the Kaaba and its people. So he was a merchant from an area called, one of the names is even Zabid. It's Zabi something, right? An area in Yemen. Al-As ibn Wa'il al-Sahmi, a powerful Qurayshi noble, purchased the goods and refused to pay. So as the middleman, he said, listen, I'll purchase them off you, I'll sell them and I'll give you the share, right? He reneged on his promise. The next day, Quraysh, the guy turns up and says, okay, so where's my share? And he's acting like nothing happened. He's like, what are you talking about? What goods? Who are you? Move away. Right? So all of this is happening. So this Yemeni merchant now, he went around asking people, various clan leaders, members for help. Nobody wanted to get involved. They said, oh, it's none of our business, none of our business. And this is a huge problem in Islam. Because in Islam, sometimes you have to make something your business, right? What about the hadith of Rasulullah where he says that if you see something bad, stop it with your hand. If you can't, stop it with your tongue. If you can't, then the least you can do is hate it in your heart, but know that that's the weakest of Iman. Sometimes you have no control over something. We can't do anything when it comes to Gaza and Israel, right? We can't physically stop it. The very next action is with your tongue, right? And if you can't even do that because they're repressing that now, then at least hate it in your heart. But, that's not the best state to be in. There's always ways of doing something. So they all said, oh, none of my business, right? So this Yemeni merchant gets very frustrated, finding no clan to defend him. He stands at the Kaaba. Do you remember I said to you, I'm going to place this guy at the Kaaba. Somebody else places him at Safa Marwa. Somebody else places him at Abu Qubais, which is a mountain opposite the Kaaba. Right? The point is that different narrations, but the end result is that he stood around about in the vicinity of the Kaaba. Wherever he's going to be close to the Kaaba. And he cried out verses of complaint in poetry. So now when you compose poetry, people listen. Right? And that poet is memorized and it ruins the reputation of people. So he composed this poem and he's chanting this poem and he's complaining. He's appealing to the sense of honor of the Quraysh as a whole. And this moment, it woke something in them. Right? And they're thinking, number one, this is bad for us. This poem's been composed. Number two, if this poem gets out and people hear this about us, we're going to lose business. Our image is going to get tarnished. We need to do something. And obviously there was some goodwill involved. And they said, it's not a nice thing what just happened as well. We're refusing to help. It's not nice. What happened to him is not nice. So let's come together and let's see what we can do. So what they did is they gathered in the house of Ibn Jud'an, a rich person. influential with a large house. A coalition of clans decided to act. Remember, as we discussed previously, there were different clans with different alliances from the time of Qusay and Abdul Manaf and then Hashim, right? You can go over the previous lectures to know those different designations. All of them came together again, and they were Banu Hashim, the Prophet's clan, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Banu al-Muttalib, Banu Zuhra, Banu Taym, Banu Asad, and Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself was present as an adult, and so was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq as an 18-year-old. They all agreed and promised. They placed their hands in a vessel of perfume. They poured it over the Kaaba and swore solemnly to support the oppressed, whether resident or visitor, to stand against the oppressor, regardless of tribe, to ensure that no wronged person in Mecca would leave without their right resolved. This was a first and a revolutionary step in tribal Arabia, sidelining all of the fractured politics that were at play, and they sided with principle over tribal loyalty for once. And this was a beautiful thing. So much so that Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said afterwards, he would later recall with deep pride, I witnessed in the house of Abdullah ibn Jud'an a pact more beloved to me than a herd of red camels. If I were called to it in Islam, I would answer. So this, even years later, he's happy with what happened, because it was justice, and Allah loves justice, and Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam loves to help people and loves justice, and he remembered this. Why would he remember this over many other things, you may ask? Because this was a sense of justice committed in the age of Jahiliyyah when it was very rare. So it's something worthy of remembering. It's like a miracle just took place, right? And red camels here means white camels. White camels, pure creamy white camels, are very expensive. So he says, this is more beloved to me than, for example, today you'd say 10 Lamborghinis. So I'd gladly sacrifice 10 Lamborghinis just to be a witness and a signatory to a pact like this. So this shows Rasulullah's lifelong approval of coalition formed on the basis of justice. But there's one thing that if you know your tribes, you will see one name missing. And this was a name that was neutral when I showed you the list of tribes when they made their pacts previously. That tribe at that time was neutral, and for various reasons. I'm not going to go through those reasons again. Now, a century later, 2 or 3 generations later, that tribe is now markedly absent. Any ideas what tribe that was? They're all Quraysh. I'll give you a clue. Later troublemakers in a big way. Okay, let's find out. So the outcome was the clans marched together to Al-As ibn Wa'il. So the outcome is that after making the pact, they all went to this guy and said, listen, dude, things are changing around here, right? We are forcing you to return everything to this guy. The Yemeni trader received his due, restored Mecca's moral face, and Mecca was back on the map again. It was always on the map, by the way. The fact remained a symbolic precedent. Even non-Muslims can unite to protect rights if the cause is just. Ibn Kathir then linked it directly as a moral counterweight to the dishonor of Harb al-Fijar. Right? So Ibn Kathir is the one saying, he says that this was a direct result of what had happened before. This is why it went to the other extreme as a counterweight. Now, the crucial absentee tribe. Why this matters. This is very important for, it's just something important to know throughout the Seerah and throughout what happened afterwards, and even what happened 3 generations before. So, political fault lines in Quraysh. Those who joined Hashim, Muttalib, Zuhra, Taym, Asad were clans known for a somewhat more principled conciliatory role. Those who absented themselves, Abdus Shams and Makhzum, represented the staunch aristocracy. Remember, at that time, Banu Hashim it was kind of neck and neck now, right? The prestige of the Hashim based on wealth, right? Society becomes corrupted and we have a false sense of honor based on wealth. And this is what started to happen in Mecca. Whereas in traditional Arab Bedouin societies, honor is measured by personality and not by wealth. But money always corrupts, right? Prophet ﷺ chose poverty over wealth. The poor were beloved to him. Imam Ghazali said, if you have the option of asking for wealth from Allah and asking for a lack of wealth, ask for a lack of wealth. Why? Because it will not distract you. People find this very strange. How can you ask for poverty? Right? So, Abdul Shams, from there came the Umayyads and Makhzum, cousins, right? They were on the rise. They were the movers and shakers now. The moral orientation prefigured future Islam Quraysh tensions. The Prophet's clan Banu Hashim stood firmly with justice. The Prophet's future enemies, Abu Jahl's clan, the Makhzum, and Abu Sufyan's clan, Abdul Shams, they stood apart. Now the Umayyad, the Abdul Shams clan was neutral when the first problems happened, when the war happened between Abdul Dar and clans and Abdul Manaf and clans. Abu Sufyan's wasn't born then, but his clan, which was the Abdul Shams, was neutral. Why? 2 reasons. Either very shrewd politically, or just too weak to be involved in anything. It's better to stay neutral and on the fence than take sides and then lose everything tomorrow. But now we can see 3 generations later, 1 century later, they are strong enough to say, well, we are not part of this. 2 reasons. 1 reason, maybe we've got shady practices and we don't want to lose our profits based on this practice, this pact that you've agreed on. Allahu A'lam. And number 2, who are they organizing everything when really we are the champions of Quraysh at the moment? And if anybody was to do it, we should have been the leaders in doing it. If we are not the leaders in doing it, then we are not going to get involved. Do you see what's happening here? Shahid, you following?
I think they're getting apart.
Yeah, they're moving away, right? You know, once you've got money and wealth, you start your own thing, right? So historians highlight this absence as an early sign. So much later, at that time, the historians didn't say it, right? But later when the signs crystallize and you have something tangible, then you can look back in hindsight and say, aha, we see what's happening here. So much later when the troubles happened with the Umayyads and the Hashemites, the killing of Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, the fight with Sayyidina Ali on one side and Amir Muawiyah on the other side, and the battle of Siffin and everything that happened, right? Then the ulama, then they said, aha, well, now we can see the earliest signs right here in this pact. Ibn Hisham and Ibn Kathir both note which clans participated and by omission make clear which did not. Later scholars connect this to the Quraysh power struggle. Those who profited from oppression refused to bind themselves to justice. That's the end of today's lecture. Have you understood this final point, by the way, Shahid?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, with power and wealth, they set up their own clan or tribe.
Yes. What happened after Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? There was the fight for the caliphate. very quickly the Umayyads became the power leaders, even above the Hashemites. Amir Muawiyah became Khalifa. Underneath him, he fought with Sayyidina Ali. We had Usman became Khalifa. He was a Umawi. He put many of his own people in positions of power based on an idea that I can trust my own. Right? Now, for better or worse, that's the decision he made. There's positives to that decision and there's negatives to that decision. The negatives came out in the face of a very sick-minded person called Marwan. Then later on, you had the war, right? You had the Imam Hassan was poisoned. Imam Hussein was killed by Abu Sufyan's grandson, Umayyah, Amir Muawiyah's son, Yazid, right? So, and then there was this tension, the Umayyads went around trying to kill all the Ahlul Bayt, and then they were overthrown by the Banu Abbasiyah, who claimed to restore Islam into the true hands of the Ahlul Bayt, but they themselves then went around killing the Ahlul Bayt, right? So this is a war that, if you know the Seerah, started at the time of Abdul Manaf. The first signs appeared at the times of Hashim, one of the ancestors of the progenitors of Harb, right? He had beef with Hisham and about who feeds who the most, prestige. And he lost and he was banished and he went to Syria. He stayed in Syria for 10 years. And that 10 years did wonders for him, because he fostered relations in Syria that when his ancestors at a later stage ended up in Syria, who are we speaking about? Muawiyah. Muawiyah already had a power base there. We know that the Umayyads, Abu Sufyan, they owned villages. In Syria, in the outskirts of Syria. What's the name of the place? To own an entire village, there's two ways of understanding it. Like the Vadera system, the feudal system, you actually own everything. They own no land. They till for you. You take all the profits and you give them something in the form of sugar. Actually, in England at that time, it wouldn't have been sugar, but you'd give them bread, you'd give them grain, you'd give them some like stuff like that to just barely make them live. Right? It's one of the worst forms of exploitation. So the Umayyads, Abu Sufyan, he didn't outright own that village, but with the Ghassanid princes, because it was in their territory, you come to agreements. Okay, we will lease this village to you. You work the village. The profits, give us rent, and the rest of the profit is yours. Right? So the fact that Abu Sufyan had a village in Syria at that time shows you how powerful he was in Syria and influential he was, right? So then you can understand why these tribes don't want to become Muslim. You can understand what they have to lose. And it's mentioned in the Seerah, and we were racing neck and neck. They fed, we fed, they did this, we did that. And all of a sudden they have brought forth a prophet. How can we compete? Right? So inshallah we'll come across these tensions. The whole Seerah is basically about this, and it starts now. So try to remember these points. Okay? Yeah, because it started in the past, it carried on during the time of Rasulullah, and then it carried on in the time of his grandchildren. His grandchildren were killed as a result of these same issues. Yeah. So not fundamental story here. So not unsurprisingly, this group decided, these two groups decided to stay away from this, so they can then tomorrow say, well, we're not a part of this. So what's going to happen now? So these groups are going to get together and say, right, we're going to enforce it, but you're up against two powerful groups now. So now your authority, these five groups, is a little bit cancelled out. Are you going to go to warfare, or do you have to make compromises? Or do you have to then, if you don't want to make the compromise, you have to then from your own pocket say, listen, we will pay you. Save face for Mecca, give the goods back, we will pay you. They would be happy with that. If this is what they are doing, then they would certainly be happy with that, thinking that's fine, we just carry on cheating. Wherever we get the money from, whether we get it from Quraysh, Hashim, or whether we get it from the other party, it doesn't matter. As long as we carry on doing what we're doing. Because now you've got two demarcated powerful lines. You can't just stand up and start bullying each other. One side cannot bully the other side. And you see this in the Seerah. It was these same groups that caused a lot of harm to Rasulullah and the companions. Names start emerging, and we will introduce the names as they come, and we should memorize them, because remember, Seerah isn't about Rasulullah, it's about everything. It's a fortnight map, right? So you need to remember the names of the Sahaba, the names of the enemies, some biographical data, inshallah, we're going to touch upon. So this was today's lesson. If we read it, we're basically going to be reading 2 pages. I suggest you read, there's nothing more, what I've taught you is more than what's in the 2 pages. So for barakah, you can read the 2 pages yourself, so we've caught up with the book, inshallah. And next lesson, inshallah, we will look into the journey that Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because now he's 20, right? He married Khadija salamullah alayha at age 25. Before that, he did something for her which made her fall in love with him. We all know the story. So we're there, right? So, and after that story, after marriage, we know, there's not much information again of what happens between age 25 to 40. So very quickly we get to Revelation, and that's another big one for us, Revelation, right? And we learn secrets about Revelation as well, by the way, that we didn't know before, inshallah, and they're going to be very illuminating, inshallah. So this is the month of Mawlid. May Allah accept our worship. This is a month of worship. We should all try to compose poetry. We should all ask Allah. We should present some poetry. Next lesson, present your poetry, no matter how good or bad it is. Let's see what comes forth from your heart. And I'll do the same thing, inshallah. And increase your salawat. Maybe aim to read the whole Seerah book by yourself this month. Aim to read a second book as well if you want. Maybe go online and see if you can learn something of the Shama'il, which is a secondary subject of Rasulullah. It just will add. So when you come back here, you're in a better position to engage with this class, inshallah. This is your testament in this month. Inshallah. May Allah give tawfiq to all of us. And may Allah forgive us our sins and give us love of Rasulullah. And may He be our intercessor on the day of reckoning. And may Allah... may Allah remove us from the haters. May Allah remove them from us, the haters that try to attack us for doing Milad. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Shahid. May Allah bless you and reward you. Thank you so much for entering. Barakallah feek. Alaikum salam.
يليق بكماله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على أسعد محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله وكما يليق بكماله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نور الهدى محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله وكما يليق بكماله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.